Patient advocacy is one of the most boring topics until you really understand its meaning. This video will be one of the only ones you click on today that could save your life or kill you if you don't pay attention. I want to spend most of today talking about 3 real-life stories of humans who are still here today that had good, bad, and ugly patient advocacy stories. I'm not going to go into great detail about their actual stories. You can check out some of their stories in videos and documentaries that have been posted around their lives, mostly on Netflix. I want to dig deep into the patient advocacy side of what happened and why it happened, and some of the questions you can ask your doctors to help ensure that maybe some of these things might not happen to you. The reality is we're constantly advocating for our health as people who are chronically ill. But once you become chronically ill or a person with disability, patient advocacy becomes a brand new meaning. It becomes your full-time job. As someone who does have a diagnosis but is primarily undiagnosed, being a patient advocate for yourself becomes a brand new meaning. It wasn't until I became an undiagnosed patient advocate for myself did I truly understand the meaning of being an advocate for my own health, but also being an advocate for the people around me and trying to advocate for them and for them to understand truly what it meant to be an advocate for themselves. Did I truly dive deep into this subject? The first story I want to bring up is this lovely documentary. Now, there are many, many stories in this documentary, but I'm going to pull out one of them. It speaks of the story of an orthopedic surgeon who was needing a hip replacement. Some of you may know the story. There's been many lawsuits about these hips, but these are cobalt hips. Cobalt hips have since been removed from the market due to their complications. I'm not going to dive deep into the fact that cobalt hips should have never been on the market to begin with due to FDA complications, but we can't talk about the things we don't control. Let's talk about the things we do control, and that's patient advocacy. The questions that this patient should have been asking should have been, how long has this new hip been on the market? How many have you put in new patients? Has there been any complications? Now, this hip was so new that chances are doctors wouldn't have had a lot of answers. And as a patient, you can make the decision as to whether or not you want to be a guinea pig and you want to potentially look into this new hip, or you can go with the tried and true version of just, getting one of the hips that people have had for many years. But that's the decision you can make as a patient who has now gotten all of the information. And that is the key. Patient advocacy is about education. And why we don't just leave it as educate yourself instead of talking about patient advocacy, I really don't truly understand that, but that is the reality. We have to dig deeper and ask the real question. If a doctor wants to put you on a new medication, how long has the medication been on the market? How long was it studied for? How long has this doctor been prescribing this medication? What does this doctor think this medication is going to do for you? We don't ask enough questions. You need to do your due diligence. Your due diligence is key to your health. Anything you are going to do to your own body, we should be asking more questions. As people who are especially undiagnosed, like myself, having a new medication that could potentially make us feel better, we're like, let's go, I'm gung-ho, let's do this. But we forget that we still have a body to protect, and we still need to make sure that we're not gonna do harm in that process. And of course, doctors don't intend on doing harm. That's never the intent. I don't think anyone goes out of their way to intend on doing harm. It is still our job as a patient to ensure that we're doing the best for us. And yes, we can blame the system, that the system is supposed to be there to do all these checks and balances and ensure that all these things are being done the right way. And if you guys are interested in me doing a deeper dive on some of the subjects we're bringing up today, you guys let me know in the comments down below, because I could talk about all these different stories in so much more detail. But I just wanted to do this high level discussion on patient advocacy today, because we haven't even talked about it on the channel, and want to talk about the third story, which is about me, which we'll get to in a minute, so stay tuned for that. But story number 2 is a story that hit really close to home, and that's about a child named Maya. Very, very fascinating story. This is another documentary that was on Netflix that I watched actually quite recently. A story that actually went onto Netflix almost 2 years ago now, a year a bit ago. There's been a lot more news information that came out just recently, because the case actually finished in late January of this year, which is absolutely mind-boggling. This story is very complicated, and if you haven't heard about the Maya story and you want to dive deep into a patient advocacy story that is like no other, my goodness. Now, I'm not going to speak about the entire Maya story, or quite frankly about any of it. I'm going to talk about the patient advocacy side of it, and how her mother absolutely documented everything. She wrote everything down, every conversation she had with nurses, every conversation she had with doctors. And it's due to all of that documentation that actually allowed them to take the actual case to court, and actually allowed them to do what they did with the final situation that happened with Maya. However, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're actually here to talk to the patient advocacy side of it. And the reason I wanted to bring this all up was because the simple fact is we need to document more. And I'm guilty of this myself. I often want to bring a notepad and paper, and I often bring my phone, and I need to take more notes. People who are chronically ill, people with disabilities, we need to be better, and we need to ensure that we document our journeys as people with disabilities. And this is not necessarily only for patient advocacy and the potentials of, something going gravely wrong like it did with Maya's story. But this is more with the intentions of just knowing full well that we can't keep everything straight in our brains. Not only because we're on all these medications, but between the chronic fatigue and the medications and the lack of sleep and everything that's going on, you can't keep 7 years of history in your head. Come on. That's just a fact. So I've been trying to practice what I preach, and I've started documenting more. This doesn't need to be pen and paper, whatever works for you, that it be notes on your phone, that it be even memos that you send to yourself, that it be email documentation that you write to yourself, whatever works for you. But every time you have a doctor's appointment, just give yourselves a Coles Notes of what was spoken about, what the changes are, and the doctors write those reports, but write it from your perspective. What happened as far as you're concerned? And then, once you get the doctor's report, was there anything that didn't jive? Was the report and what you wrote down, was anything off? Did anything, didn't make any sense? Was something missed? And document those things, because long term, that could be meaningful. And there are things that change over time, things that are missed, especially in a case like mine, where I'm still fighting for a diagnosis on my nerve-related issues, and we still haven't figured out what was going on. Things can be missed. Things can be forgotten. And I'm constantly seeing new specialties. I'm constantly going back to old specialties, and those specialties are like, well, what was done 5 years ago? And some of it was documented, some of it wasn't documented, and we're questioning these things. So ensure that you document, especially if you've got a lengthy history. Even if, let's say you end up in a hospital at some point and you get better, that's fabulous. But the reality is you just don't know what the future is going to hold. And having that document stored away, and let's say 5 years down the road something else happens, being able to go back to that and just not having to have it in your brain just sitting there, and just knowing it's documented can be just a huge relief to know that it's just there. So please document your medical journeys, not with the intentions of sharing them with the world like I do, but for your own sake of knowing that you've got it in your own words, on paper or wherever, whatever you're gonna do with it, so that you can go back and trace back what has happened to you from a medical perspective. Now, my story, where are we at? From a patient advocacy perspective, something has happened recently and I wanted to share it with you guys, and it speaks to patient advocacy because quite frankly, I wasn't gonna say anything. And not in the sense that I wasn't gonna tell you guys, but I just wasn't gonna say anything at all. I wasn't gonna tell my doctors. I hemmed and hawed and was gonna tell my family doctor when we were in with her, and I didn't say anything. And then a week later, I was in with my gastroenterologist and I was hemming and hawing about whether to bring it up with her. I had had COVID, as some of you are aware. If you missed some of those videos, please go back and watch them. They were quite the story, my COVID story back in November. And ever since I had COVID, I've been feeling kind of off in my esophagus. And I've been having some swallowing difficulties now. About a month ago, I had a turmeric pill get stuck and get lodged in my esophagus and actually dissolve inside of my esophagus. Didn't really think much of it because I'd been having these swallowing issues and they've been progressively getting worse and then getting a bit better and then getting worse again. And I just kind of been not really thinking too much of it. Now, I haven't had an esophageal scope in about 3 years now. I typically get them done with my colonoscopies through my gastroenterologist. This typically gets done every 3 to 5 years. It's been 3 years since I had an esophageal scope. Haven't had a colonoscopy in 2 years now because my Crohn's has been fairly well managed. I was in with my gastro and we were just chit-chatting and having my regular appointment. And she asked me if anything was off. Like I said, I wasn't gonna say anything because I just didn't think it was that big of a deal. When you deal with chronic pain and chronic conditions like I do, there's one of these things that you shrug off a lot. You deal with so much on a day-to-day basis that you just don't think about these things anymore. You deal with it and you move forward. I don't know what in me decided to tell her about this, but I told her about what had happened and the fact that this pill had gotten stuck, and that lately I just haven't been able to swallow food quite the same way, and that things had been kind of off since I had had COVID. You have to know that viral infections in me are notorious inflammatory markers. And for some reason, every time I have a major viral flare, like having COVID, my symptoms get way worse for months. And then sometimes it'll get better, or sometimes I just stay at that new baseline. It's how I started becoming sick to begin with. My gastroenterologist was like, no, let's do an esophageal scope. It's been a couple of years. Put a camera down your throat and let's just see what happens. Her thought at the time was that there would most likely just be narrowing and that there could be indication that my Crohn's had gotten worse. But she's like, let's do the scope and just see what happens. Didn't think too much of it. Her best guess, we were booking into July for my scope. And we thought, okay, cool. I'll see you in a couple months. I get a call 2 weeks later that she has a cancellation. I didn't have to do any major prep. I just had to stop drinking and eating 12 hours before the scope. My mom brings me in for the scope. No big deal. My doctor brings me in, I have my scope. She tells me if there is any narrowing, we're gonna stretch the esophagus. There could be potential complications. Are you good with that? And I'm like, yes, that's not a problem. We had spoken about that during my appointment. I had to ask her a couple questions about potential complications, patient advocacy. I had done my due diligence about this. I'd also known that with Crohn's and with the potential reality of me having Crohn's for almost 8 years, we knew that there was gonna come a day that my Crohn's was gonna get worse. It's just kind of the reality, considering the rest of my complications and the fact that my body just doesn't work right. So I had every expectations that I was either gonna come out with a stressed esophagus or that at a minimum, my esophagus was being inflamed, which is what was causing issues. I came out of my scope with very different information. And this is where things went a little awry. We didn't really know what was going on at this point, but the nurse came in and said, I'm letting you know your doctor is going to come out and come and talk to you. And I want to let you guys know that isn't normal. Typically what will happen, and I've had, 6 of these down now, typically the doctor doesn't come back out and come and have a chat with you. Typically you will get a report that states kind of what had happened during your scope, and it'll give you like a report of what to do at home and your next appointment with the gastro. That's your typical protocol. This time around, my doctor was coming back out to come and talk to me. I'm like, okay. And the nurse said, oh, and by the way, they sent a bunch of stuff to pathology. And what this means, and this was more on the normal side, was that they had taken biopsies of my esophagus and sent them to pathology to get looked at. So my doctor comes back out and looks at me and gives me the weirdest look ever. And I've been with her for almost 6 years now, so I know her fairly well. We've got a pretty good rapport. And she gives me this weirdest look ever. And she lets me know that they had taken 2 polyps out of my esophagus. And that was a little strange. She didn't expect to find polyps in my esophagus, so they had removed them. They were sending them off to pathology. And that they had taken 4 additional biopsies in my esophagus to find out whether or not I had any inflammation, to see whether or not my Crohn's had gotten worse, all of those types of things, and send them off to pathology. We are now waiting for the results of those 6 biopsies. So 2 polyps and 4 additional biopsies were taken during my scope. And now we're waiting. And the reason I tell you guys this story is not only to just share you guys an update on where I'm at, but is to let you guys know that what was something I was just gonna not say anything to my gastro turned out to be a fairly important scope, because my doctor found 2 things that shouldn't have been there. I had had a scope done less than 3 years ago and the polyps weren't there. Polyps are not supposed to be found in the esophagus. The fact that they were there to begin with is very odd, which is why I'm assuming my doctor was a little concerned. So the fact that they were there is not good. I'm being referred to a new specialty called ENT, ears, nose, throat specialist, which we're referring and waiting for a referral for. I'm gonna leave it at that, in the sense that the reality is, when you know something's wrong, it's probably because you know something's wrong. There's one thing that I will always, always, always say. Nobody knows our bodies better than ourselves. And I think when we talk about patient advocacy, it's the strongest piece of evidence that we have. And some doctors truly don't believe that we know our bodies best. And if there's one lasting piece from this video, if you're watching this, if a doctor doesn't truly believe that you know your body better than they do, it's time to seek a new doctor. That it be a new specialist, that it be at least a second opinion at a minimum. It is truly, truly the reality. You know your body better than anybody else. You've lived with it the longest. They see you for 10 minutes. So when you know something's off, you know something's off. If you are chronically ill, if you are disabled, don't let the little symptoms go. Because I almost did, and we have no idea where this is gonna lead. And now we're waiting for pathology results. We don't have them yet, so we'll keep you guys posted once we know more. But this opened my eyes to the reality that you can't let those little things go. You know when something is wrong. You know when symptoms are getting worse. You know, because you know your body. You just do. So advocate for yourself. Don't let the little things go. I hope today has helped somebody out there. If you guys have any questions at all, any comments, please, please leave them down below. Subscribed if this has helped you. We're hoping to do more videos like this in the future. Of course, we'll keep you guys posted once we know more about mind pathology results. And don't forget to check out those 2 videos on Netflix. I really found them very, very interesting about the system themselves. But don't forget, you only control what you control, and don't let it, freak you out too much. Remember the patient advocacy side of things, and don't forget to slow your roll. We'll see you guys next time. If you'd like to check out my COVID story and its madness, check it out over here.